Welcome back to Heretics and Heroes, everyone. Today I am here to tell you that in order to become a master miniature painter, you need to learn physics.
Yes, science!
Wait, don't click off the video just yet. We're not going to have to do any math. An intuitive understanding will do just fine. But we need to talk about how light interacts with the objects you see around you every day. In one of my previous videos, I gave some alternatives to edge highlighting, and I'll link that video here. Alternative number 2 was volumetric highlighting, and I gave a little demo by drawing some shapes in Photoshop, which I think is still worth a watch. But I'll give you the abbreviated version here. Light falls on objects in a way that mimics the fundamental shape of that object. On a sphere, it's circular. On a cylinder, it's rectangular. On a cone, it's triangular. And on a cube or pyramid, the light fills the faces of the object at varying intensities based on the direction of the light source. Basically, every object is composed of some combination of these basic shapes. They can sometimes be very easy to identify, consisting of just one or two shapes, but sometimes you get something a bit more complex. Take a Space Marine pauldron. It's a combination of a quarter sphere and a half cylinder. But to complicate things further, the trim also sometimes behaves a little bit like a cube due to its right-angled faces. And don't get me started on organic shapes. This sort of thing is all drawing 101, and if you're interested in learning more, it certainly wouldn't hurt to pick up an art book or look up some drawing tutorials here on YouTube. But it is not the whole story. How much of the surface should be taken up by your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights? How much contrast do you need? How much will the environment affect your color choices? Even under identical lighting conditions, different materials will have different answers to these questions. Today's test subject will be this Space Marine. Even though there are a handful more complex shapes on there, the majority of Space Marine armor is pretty geometric. Let's start with the pauldrons. I'm planning on going for a creamy off-white color. When painting white, it's generally a good idea to not use white at all. It's the lightest color in your arsenal, which leaves little room to build highlights, and it is lethally neutral. It'll suck the life out of anything it touches. Instead, we can work with various off-whites and grays. As long as this surface ends up being the lightest overall on the model, it'll still read as white just fine. I want the surface of the pauldrons to read as a really nice matte white paint, and I'm not just talking about the physical paints that I'll be using, I mean with relation to the fictional light source that is shining on my Marine. I'm choosing direct sunlight here. It's something we're all very familiar with in real life, so it should be pretty intuitive to work with. Not to mention, it lends itself well to references. So let's quickly look at how sunlight behaves in real life on matte surfaces. As you can see, there is this really distinct division between the light side and the dark side of the object, with only a very narrow area of transition. This allows the illuminated area and the shaded area to exist in their own little worlds. There's reasonably high contrast across the two areas, but not much contrast at all within them. The brightest point on the light side is not that different from the darkest point, and the same is true in reverse for the shadows. You can even see this relationship play out on a complex surface like fur. So what's going on here? Well, put on your lab safety glasses because this is where the physics kicks in. We need to understand the difference between diffuse and specular reflections. On a perfectly smooth surface, light bounces off at exactly the same angle that it comes in at. This is called a specular reflection, and it's the reason why if you stand in front of a mirror, you see a perfect reflection. All the light from your face comes right back at you. But if you move just a little bit to the side and try to view at an angle, well, you just see the other side of the room. Diffuse reflections occur on rough surfaces, which on a microscopic level are just a bunch of tiny smooth surfaces jumbled together. This causes light to reflect fairly randomly, which perfectly explains what was happening to the objects I observed on my walk, even if it's not immediately apparent why. We will get back to painting soon, I promise, but please bear with me for one more diagram. This one is important. We'll need an object, a light source, and an observer. Since our object has a rough surface, the light rays coming in are going to scatter on impact, throwing reflections in all different directions. This means that our observer is receiving roughly the same intensity of light across the surface that the light hits. But right around here, we're going to start getting some rather extreme angles of impact. Even with our diffuse reflections, the amount of light going towards our observer starts to rapidly decrease, creating that transition area we observed before. Finally, the angle becomes so extreme, the light simply can't reach, creating our shadows. Now let's combine this with what I said at the very beginning about how light conforms to shape. I've base coated with a tan color mixed with just a tiny little bit of purple. Then I divide the shape into the illuminated and the dark side. On the light side, I highlight up into off-white, and on the dark side, I go down with just a little bit more purple to get my deepest shadow. And voila. Pretty hardcore for just painting some shoulder pads, right? Well, think of it like this. I just showed you how to shade every single matte surface you'll ever paint going forward. Plus, we'll need this foundation for the rest of the video. Now it's on to the main armor. We can start by laying down our shadow color over the whole surface. I'm going for a dark green-blue mix, as I'll be painting the rest a fairly warm green, so that cold-warm contrast should play out nicely. I want this to look like a semi-gloss paint going over a fairly rough surface, which means something interesting is going to happen here. We'll actually be getting a surface that displays the properties of both diffuse and specular reflection. If our white pauldrons were about here on the diffuse to specular scale, our armor surface is not going to be all that different. However, the finish of the paint is going to be much closer to up here. What is this going to look like? Well, we can look at our handy diagram once again. For a majority of the surface, our observer will be getting mostly diffuse reflections. But in a narrow area, our observer is going to get something approximating a proper reflection of the sun due to the specular reflections created by the glossy paint. In fact, another way to think of diffuse versus specular is almost like the resolution of your reflection. The closer that you get to the end of this scale, the smaller the area of illumination from your primary light source becomes. What this means for our painting process is we can start mapping our illuminated areas in much the same way we would for a more matte surface. A fairly well-defined light side and dark side with a narrow transition area in between. Remember to pay attention to your fundamental shapes during this step. Now we can get a bit more aggressive with our highlighting. This step is where the magic happens. I'm going to build up at least 2 more highlight layers following our established patterns, working my way towards that highest reflection in a nice pale yellow. I'm going to avoid white here for 2 reasons. I don't want to desaturate the overall look of the green, and I want to leave room for other materials to have even brighter reflections than this, which I'll get to in the next section. There is not much left to do to finish off the armor. I kept my layers well thinned down so my transitions are relatively smooth. You may have also noticed that when layering, I was making a lot of long, scratchy strokes, which serves as both a bit of cross-hatching to help with blending, but also as a sort of built-in weathering to help sell that well-worn look to the armor. A little bit of glazing will help smooth things out and bring a bit of vibrance back into my green. If you'd like a detailed rundown of how to control your paint for the layering and glazing steps, check out this video where I painted up Lieutenant Titus. I'm mostly happy with how that armor turned out, except it's looking a little too close to a metallic surface, and I think that's due to contrast. So let's bring my shadows up a little lighter to get them where I want. Speaking of contrast and metallic surfaces, the Gigabrained intellect maxers amongst you may have noticed that in my alternate description of the reflection scale, I chose the term resolution and not intensity. That's because in my estimation, we need a whole other scale to describe that, which I'm going to give the very scientific name, the shininess scale. So why do we need this extra measurement? Well, take an ordinary stone and polish it to a mirror finish. Nobody's going to mistake that for a piece of metal, let alone a mirror, despite the fact that it is almost maxed out on our specular reflection scale. Now consider that even a very rough piece of metal can reflect quite a bit of light, or be shiny, as it were. Clearly, something else is at work. We don't need to get too deep into the specifics, but metals have a unique molecular structure that allows them to reflect more light than other materials, regardless of how diffuse or specular those reflections are. The obvious first takeaway is that metallic surfaces are going to have much sharper contrast than other non-metallic surfaces, and this is enough info to get us started. There is, however, another very important but less obvious result of this property that we're going to get to in a minute. The way that I like to start my non-metallics is base coating in what is essentially going to be my deepest shadow color. I typically don't like to use black here because I feel like it just sucks too much saturation out of the whole thing. For this one, I'm going with Rhinox hide mixed with refractive green from Vallejo. I chose this mix because I want to go for a brass color rather than a rich gold. What I like to do next is take one of my mid-tone colors and just apply that directly over the dark base coat. This is going to let me map out the illuminated areas of the metal while also producing some of that very high contrast that is necessary to sell the NMM effect. I want the surface of this to look relatively well cared for and well polished, but not quite a mirror sheen, something that has seen a little bit of wear and tear. To do this, we'll just keep our brightest reflections relatively constrained in terms of area. And I'll remind you once again, I think it's worthwhile to keep your layers very thin here. That's going to allow you to both build up that necessary contrast, but also then not have to go on and work on the transitions later on. From here, it's just a matter of layering up to our absolute brightest highlights. This is where you could go all the way up to white, should you so choose, though I still prefer to stop at like an off-white, and that is just purely a matter of maintaining saturation. Sometimes saturated to desaturated creates just as much, if not more, contrast than dark to light. Now that we have our highlights mapped out, we should tackle the other consequence of how shiny metals are: secondary reflections, which are just reflections of something other than your primary light source. Secondary reflections are not wholly unique to metallic surfaces. You can get them on non-metallic surfaces too, but they usually have to come from a true light source. OSL is an example of this. But metals, due to how intensely shiny they are much more sensitive to potential light sources in their surroundings. So much so that even nearby objects or just the ambient light in the environment can serve as secondary light sources. I snapped a picture to use as a reference for painting this model that I think illustrates this really well. This is the main illuminated area, including our primary light source reflection. Here's our transition to our deepest shadow. Then on the other side of that, we have some secondary reflections. This one is clearly a bit blue and seems to be coming from above, so I'm assuming that this is a sky reflection. This area here is relatively light, so is probably the white paint on the house over my right shoulder. Then we've got a little bit of a green shift here, which is probably picking up a bit of the grass. So let's use this as a guide for painting. I'll add a sky reflection to the helmet here. Then I'll try to get a bit of a reflection coming off of the gun, which I'm going to paint red. We can get some green reflections in the surfaces facing the armor, and on the rest of the surfaces that need a little bit more definition, we can just do some global illumination coming off of the environments. Will this video make you an expert at non-metallic metal all on its own? No, there are other considerations like contrast ratios and color choices that are also going to be very important and deserve their own deep dive. I promise you, I will make that video sometime in the future, but hopefully this will give you a little bit of theoretical foundation to build upon should you want to try and learn the technique. The last thing I want to talk about is a special case that gave me a little bit of trouble while I was coming up with this video because at first glance it seemed like it didn't fit my explanations. And that is chrome, or really any mirror-like surface. I was thinking, well, where is the illuminated area and where are the shadows? According to my own theories, as you get further along the scale towards specular reflections, the illuminated area should shrink and the shadow area should grow, but that's not what this looks like at all. Until I realized that these materials are also completely maxed out on the shininess scale too. So the main illuminated area shrinks to just be a reflection of the light source itself, leaving the entire rest of the surface to be the shadow area, which, as a result of having both perfectly specular and extremely intense reflections, just becomes a one-to-one recreation of its surroundings, then warped by the shape of the object. So if I want to make this circular plate on the backpack chrome, there's only one way to do it right. We're gonna have to paint a happy little landscape. So what have we learned today, class? I think there are two main takeaways. The first is that you should really familiarize yourself with how to shade fundamental shapes. I know I skimmed through that topic pretty quickly at the beginning of the video, so if you need more information or practice with that, the good news is that there are a million artists' resources that you can find across the web. The second main takeaway is that pretty much any material can be described with some combination of rating on the reflection and shininess scale. For example, wood would rank pretty low on both. A chunk of raw iron is going to be quite low on the reflection scale, but relatively high on the shininess scale. Smooth plastic is going to be high on the reflection scale, but pretty low on the shininess scale. And a piece of polished steel armor is going to be nearly maxed out on both. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you had a good time and learned something useful. But before you go, let me show you how the whole thing turned out. If you're wondering what chapter that Space Marine I painted belongs to, well, he is the first in my homebrew Salamander's successor. I haven't yet landed on a final name for them, so I'll be looking to the community for help with that. Throw your suggestions down in the comments. So far, I'm thinking either the Brass Dragons or the Hammer Forged. if you want to go the extra mile and support this channel financially, consider joining my Patreon. You'll get access to my Discord server where we are growing a great little community of mini painters. You'll also get behind-the-scenes updates, greater voting power in community polls, and exclusive tutorial videos, like the full-length version of the chrome painting that I did in this video. At the higher tiers, you can get personalized comment and critique on your models, or even full private lessons. Huge shout out to my current paid members. You make this all possible. Thanks again, everyone, and until next time, I'll see you on the tabletop.